Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. The year, if we could call it that, floats somewhere around 4500 BCE, though time itself moves differently in this era, measured not by calendars, but by the rising and falling of rivers, by the migration of fish, by the slow accumulation of silt that will one day become the foundation of everything we know about civilization. The landscape stretches before us as an endless expanse of marshland, a world caught between water and sky, where the horizon dissolves into shimmering heat mirages that the locals have not yet learned to name. Reed beds taller than any person rustle in a wind that carries the smell of mud and rotting vegetation and something else, something faintly sulphurous, rising from hot springs that bubble up through the delta. This is southern Mesopotamia before Mesopotamia exists as a concept, before anyone has drawn the first cuneiform wedge, before the first temple rises from the muck. You probably won't survive this, at least not in the sense that your modern body would immediately succumb to parasites, waterborne diseases, venomous snakes hiding in the reeds, and the general hostility of a landscape that views human beings as temporary visitors at best. But your mind can survive here, drifting through the ancient evening as the sun sets over waters that seem to extend forever, painting everything in shades of amber and copper and deep, arterial red. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know the algorithm demands these little rituals, and I find that vaguely amusing, this idea that a computer somewhere cares whether you press a button before we explore the mysteries of ancient Sumer together. But here we are, in an age where digital approval feeds digital systems just as surely as offerings once fed temple gods, and perhaps there is something poetically appropriate about that. Now, wherever you are listening to this, whether tucked into bed in Toronto at midnight, or commuting through Tokyo at dawn, or lying on a beach in Barcelona watching the stars emerge one by one, take a moment to notice where your body rests in space and time. Some of you have made this a ritual, this bedtime journey through history, and I appreciate that more than I can properly express. Some of you are new, perhaps drawn by the algorithm we just discussed, and I welcome you to this strange little corner of the internet, where we whisper about ancient gods and forgotten peoples until sleep claims us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Sumerian temple rises before us, though calling it a temple at this early stage might be overly generous. What we see is a modest platform of packed mud, perhaps 6 feet high and 30 feet across, supporting a structure of woven reeds that looks somewhat like an oversized basket turned upside down and hollowed out. Smoke rises from within, carrying the scent of burning juniper and rendered animal fat, offerings to gods whose names have not yet stabilized into the forms we would later recognize. A priest, or perhaps we should say a proto-priest, since the elaborate hierarchies of later Sumerian religion have not yet developed, moves around the platform's edge, scattering barley flour in patterns that might be writing or might simply be abstract designs meant to please divine eyes. His name is lost to us, lost to everyone, vanished into the fog of pre-literate history, but we can imagine him as a man of perhaps 40 years, ancient by the standards of his time, his skin weathered by decades of marsh sun, his fingers stained permanently yellow from handling sacred substances. He knows things that will not be written down for another 1,000 years, secrets passed mouth to ear through generations of ritual specialists, and when he speaks to his students, he uses a language that sits somewhere on the evolutionary tree between Proto-Euphratic and early Sumerian, a tongue that linguists can only dimly reconstruct through loanwords preserved in later texts, like fossils trapped in linguistic amber. The temple platform faces east toward the rising sun, though the priests of this era do not yet associate their chief deity with solar symbolism in the way later Mesopotamian cultures will. Instead, they orient their sacred space toward the source of fresh water, the great marshes that provide everything their community needs to survive. Fish swim lazily through channels between the reed beds, so numerous that children can catch them with their bare hands, which is frankly rather convenient since the children of this era have limited entertainment options, and catching dinner at least gives them something productive to do. The mainstream historical fact we encounter first in this murky pre-dawn of civilization concerns the Ubaid culture, which archaeological evidence tells us dominated southern Mesopotamia for roughly 2,000 years before the Sumerians proper emerged as a distinct cultural entity. These Ubaid people, named after the tell where their distinctive pottery was first discovered, built the first permanent settlements in the region, drained the first marshes for agriculture, and constructed the first temple platforms that would eventually evolve into the towering ziggurats of later Sumerian cities. Their pottery features geometric designs and stylized lizard-headed figurines that have puzzled archaeologists for over a century, leading to numerous interpretations ranging from the scholarly suggestion that these represent nursing mothers wearing ceremonial headdresses to the somewhat more colorful theory that the Ubaid people were depicting actual reptilian beings who ruled over humanity in ancient times. Now, speaking of those lizard-headed figurines, we encounter our first piece of quirky fringe interpretation for this section. In 1919, the archaeologist Harry Reginald Hall excavated a site near and discovered numerous clay figurines depicting humanoid forms with elongated heads, slanted eyes, and distinctly reptilian features. Hall interpreted these as representations of the Ubaid mother goddess, a reasonable scholarly conclusion supported by the fact that many of the figurines appear to be nursing infants. However, alternative researchers have seized upon these artifacts as evidence that reptilian extraterrestrials once walked among ancient Mesopotamians, teaching them the arts of civilization and demanding worship in return. The theory has gained surprising traction in certain corners of the internet, where it intersects with broader narratives about ancient astronauts, interdimensional beings, and the general conviction that our ancestors could not possibly have developed civilization on their own without extraterrestrial assistance. I find this interpretation charming in its enthusiasm, if somewhat lacking in its respect for the ingenuity of ancient peoples, who managed to invent agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, and writing without any help from space lizards. Thank you very much. The scholarly debate that concerns us here revolves around the transition from Ubaid to Sumerian culture, a process that remains hotly contested among Mesopotamian specialists. Some scholars argue for cultural continuity, suggesting that the Sumerians were simply the Ubaid people by another name, their culture evolving gradually over centuries without any significant population replacement. Others point to linguistic evidence suggesting that the Sumerians arrived from elsewhere, bringing with them a language unrelated to any other known tongue, a linguistic isolate that stands alone in the family tree of human speech, like a tree that somehow grew without roots. The Sumerian king list, composed millennia later, describes a time before the flood when kingship descended from heaven and was established first in the city of Eridu, which archaeological evidence confirms as one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in the region. But whether this reflects genuine historical memory or mythological elaboration remains the subject of papers, conferences, and the occasional heated argument at academic social gatherings where scholars who have devoted their entire careers to these questions finally get enough wine in them to speak their true opinions. The evening settles over the marsh temple like a warm blanket, and the proto-priest concludes his evening rituals with a final scatter of barley flour and a muttered prayer in his antique tongue. His community numbers perhaps 200 souls, living in reed houses clustered around the temple platform, their lives bounded by the rhythm of the seasons, by the annual flooding that brings both destruction and renewal, by the simple necessities of food and shelter and reproduction that have governed human existence since our species first stood upright on the African savanna. They do not know that they are living in prehistory, that their way of life represents a transitional moment between the hunting-gathering existence of their remote ancestors and the complex urban civilization that will emerge over the coming millennia. They simply live, as humans always have, doing their best to make sense of a world that often refuses to make sense, telling stories to explain the inexplicable, building temples to house powers they do not fully understand. The children of the community splash in the shallows near the reed houses, their laughter carrying across the water as the first stars emerge overhead. These are the same stars that will later be catalogued by Babylonian astronomers, given names and stories, and incorporated into the vast mythological framework that will explain humanity's place in the cosmic order. But for now, they are simply lights in the sky, beautiful and mysterious, offering no explanation for themselves beyond their own radiance. One of the children, a girl of perhaps 7 years, pauses in her play to stare upward, and we might imagine her wondering, in whatever way children of this era wondered, what those distant fires might be and whether anything lives among them. The fringe theorists would have us believe that her answer would come soon enough, that within a few generations, beings from those very stars would descend to transform her descendants' world forever. The mainstream historians would suggest that she was simply a child looking at stars, as children have done since time immemorial, finding wonder in the natural world without requiring supernatural explanation. Both interpretations have their appeal, one offering cosmic significance, the other offering the quiet dignity of human autonomy, and perhaps the truth, as so often happens, lies somewhere in the complicated space between them. The temple priest retires to his sleeping mat, a simple affair of woven reeds covered with sheep's wool, and his dreams, we might suppose, are filled with the gods he serves, beings whose names will eventually stabilize into the Anunnaki, though at this early stage they remain fluid and formless, more feeling than figure, more presence than person. The concept of a pantheon with fixed relationships and hierarchies lies centuries in the future, waiting for urbanization and specialization and the administrative need to organize divine powers into comprehensible categories. For now, the gods are simply the gods, powerful and capricious, demanding and sometimes generous, as much a part of the natural world as the fish in the marshes or the birds that wheel overhead at dawn. The mainstream scholarly position on pre-Anunnaki religion emphasizes this fluidity, noting that the elaborate mythological texts we possess date from much later periods and cannot be retroactively projected onto earlier eras without significant distortion. The gods that the Ubaid people worshipped may have borne little resemblance to the Anunnaki of later Sumerian mythology, just as the Christian god of medieval Europe bore only structural resemblance to the Yahweh of ancient Israel, despite the claimed continuity between them. Religion evolves, adapting to changing social circumstances, absorbing new influences, shedding elements that no longer serve their community's needs. The Anunnaki, as we know them from textual sources, are late creations, however ancient their roots, composite beings assembled from centuries of theological reflection and mythological elaboration. But the fringe interpretation counters that the later texts preserve genuine memories of earlier events, that the Anunnaki were real beings who arrived on Earth in the distant past and whose actions were recorded, however imperfectly, by the scribes who came after. This interpretation treats mythology as garbled history rather than creative theology, finding in the ancient stories evidence of advanced technology, genetic engineering, and interplanetary travel that our ancestors could describe only in the metaphorical language available to them. When the texts speak of gods descending from heaven, the fringe theorists hear echoes of spacecraft landing. When the texts describe the creation of humanity from clay, they see references to genetic manipulation. When the texts mention the Anunnaki mining gold, they imagine extraterrestrial resource extraction operations. It is a compelling narrative, I must admit, one that transforms ancient myth into cosmic drama and gives human history a scope and significance that purely naturalistic interpretations cannot match. The scholarly debate that emerges from this tension concerns the nature of mythology itself. What are these stories for? What do they mean? And how should we interpret them? The functionalist school argues that myths serve social purposes, reinforcing cultural values, explaining natural phenomena, and legitimizing political arrangements. The structuralist school seeks deep patterns underlying surface narratives, finding in mythology evidence of universal cognitive structures that shape human thought across cultures. The historical school looks for real events behind mythological elaborations, treating texts as potential evidence for actual occurrences, however distorted by time and retelling. And the psychological school, following Jung, interprets myths as expressions of collective human consciousness, archetypal dramas that reveal truths about the human condition regardless of their historical accuracy. Each approach offers insights, and each has limitations, and the responsible scholar must somehow navigate among them, selecting the appropriate tool for each interpretive task. The night deepens over the marsh temple, and the sounds of the community gradually fade as families settle into sleep. The water laps gently against the reed platforms that support the houses, a sound that has soothed human beings since before we were human, the rhythm of waves against shore that connects us to our aquatic ancestors and the primordial seas from which all life emerged. In a very real sense, these marsh dwellers live at the boundary between worlds, between water and land, between nature and culture, between prehistory and history. They stand at the threshold of something enormous, a transformation that will see their descendants build cities and empires, write poetry and law, develop mathematics and astronomy, and eventually send their children out to the stars that their ancestors once watched with wondering eyes. But they do not know this, cannot know this, just as we cannot know what transformations await our own descendants in the millennia to come. They simply sleep, as we are beginning to sleep, trusting that tomorrow will bring another day much like the one before, that the fish will still swim in the marshes, that the gods will still accept their offerings, that the great wheel of existence will continue to turn as it always has. The proto-priest mutters in his sleep, fragments of prayers, or perhaps just the random neural firings that produce dreams in all mammals, and if we could somehow enter his dreaming mind, we might see the gods as he imagines them, shapes of mist and fire, voices speaking from the depths of water, presences felt but never quite seen. These are the gods before the Anunnaki, the divine powers that existed in human imagination before Sumerian civilization codified and named them, and in some ways they are more real than their later counterparts precisely because they have not yet been pinned down, have not yet been reduced to categories and hierarchies and administrative functions. They are gods in their wild state, as dangerous and beautiful as the marshes themselves, and the proto-priest serves them with a mixture of love and fear that later generations will institutionalize into formal religious practice but can never quite replicate. The mainstream position on prehistoric religion emphasizes how little we actually know about these early belief systems, dependent as we are on material remains that can only hint at the immaterial convictions that animated ancient lives. We can excavate temple platforms but not prayers, unearth figurines but not the meanings attached to them, recover ritual objects but not the rituals themselves. The interpretive gap between artifact and belief yawns wide, and scholars who claim certainty about pre-literate religion are either working with extremely limited evidence or filling that gap with assumptions that may reveal more about their own beliefs than those of their ancient subjects. The fringe interpretation, paradoxically, often claims greater certainty, drawing on textual sources from later periods and projecting them backward in time, treating the Anunnaki myths as windows into the deep past rather than products of the much later periods in which they were composed. This approach has its own internal logic, but it requires accepting premises that mainstream scholarship rejects, premises about the reliability of mythological memory and the nature of the beings described. We float above the sleeping community, looking down at the scatter of reed houses and the modest temple platform and the endless marshes stretching away in every direction, and we think about time and change and the strange continuity that connects these ancient people to us. They are our ancestors, not in the direct genetic sense necessarily, but in the cultural sense that their innovations would eventually spread throughout the world, touching every subsequent civilization, shaping the foundations upon which we still build. When we write, we use a system descended from their cuneiform. When we tell time, we use a system derived from their sexagesimal mathematics. When we imagine gods dwelling in heaven, we echo cosmological ideas that originated in their temples. They gave us so much, these forgotten marsh dwellers, and they asked nothing in return, expecting nothing, knowing nothing of the future they were creating through their daily struggles to survive and thrive and make sense of their world. The dawn will come soon, painting the eastern sky in colors that have not changed since life first crawled from the primordial waters, and the community will wake to another day of fishing and farming and praying and playing. The children will grow up to have children of their own, generation succeeding generation in an unbroken chain that stretches from these reed houses to the bedroom where you now lie, your own body carrying traces of ancestry that connect you, however tenuously, to every human who has ever lived. The Anunnaki have not yet arrived in this story, if they ever will arrive in any literal sense, but their time approaches. The conditions that will produce them, urbanization, writing, social complexity, philosophical reflection on the nature of divine power, are slowly assembling themselves in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, and within a few centuries the gods will have names and faces and stories that we can actually read. But for now, there is only the soft sound of water and wind, the distant bark of a marsh dog, the breathing of 200 people sleeping in houses made of reeds, dreaming dreams that we can never share but might, with effort and imagination, dimly approximate. Let this section close as it began, with water and darkness and the distant promise of transformation, and let us drift together toward the next stage of our journey, when the world will begin to change in ways that even the prophetic among our marsh dwellers could never have imagined. The centuries pass like clouds over water, each generation living and dying in the marshes, each leaving behind a thin stratum of debris that archaeologists will one day sift through with tiny brushes and infinite patience, and we move forward through time now, skipping like a stone across the surface of history, touching down occasionally to observe the slow accumulation of changes that will eventually produce the world the Anunnaki will inhabit. The landscape remains fundamentally the same, all water and reeds and endless sky, but the human presence within it has grown and complexified, the scattered reed villages consolidating into larger settlements, the simple temple platforms expanding into more elaborate structures that require coordinated labor to construct and maintain. We are somewhere around 4000 BCE now, still 1,000 years before the first cuneiform texts will allow history proper to begin, but the foundations are being laid, quite literally, the mud bricks stacking up year after year, creating the physical infrastructure that will support one of humanity's first experiments in urban living. The indigenous cosmology of these people centers on water, which makes perfect sense given that water surrounds them on every side, defines their landscape, determines their possibilities, limits their movements, and provides their sustenance. In the beginning, their stories say, there was only water, an endless undifferentiated expanse stretching in all directions without boundary or shore. This primordial water was alive, conscious, vast beyond imagination, and within its depths stirred powers that would eventually produce the world we know. Modern scholars recognize in these creation narratives early attempts to grapple with fundamental questions about existence and origin, questions that have occupied human minds from the very first moments of reflective consciousness and continue to occupy them today in forms that are more sophisticated but perhaps not essentially different. The primordial waters have names now, or are beginning to acquire names, emerging from the fog of pre-literate religion into the clearer outlines of recorded mythology. Abzu is the freshwater abyss, the sweet water that rises through springs and flows through rivers, the source of agricultural fertility and the foundation upon which all life depends. Tiamat is the saltwater ocean, the vast and dangerous deep that surrounds the known world and threatens to swallow it, the mother of monsters and the ultimate symbol of chaos. Between and around these primal powers, other deities are beginning to take shape, younger gods who will eventually challenge and defeat their parents, establishing the cosmic order that allows human civilization to exist. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, as one tends to do when discussing Mesopotamian mythology, where the later elaborate texts so thoroughly dominate our understanding that we project them backward onto periods where they do not belong. In this era before the Sky Lords, before Anu establishes his celestial throne and his children divide the cosmos among themselves, the gods are still emerging, still differentiating from the primal unity, still finding their specific identities and spheres of influence. The mainstream Sumerian historical fact for this section concerns the development of irrigation agriculture, which archaeological evidence shows was well underway by the 5th millennium BCE. The natural flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates provided water for crops, but this flooding was unreliable, arriving at the wrong times or failing to arrive at all, threatening harvests with either drought or inundation. The solution was artificial irrigation, channels and canals that could direct water where and when it was needed, transforming the uncertain bounty of nature into the predictable productivity that urban civilization requires. This was an enormous undertaking, requiring coordinated labor on a scale previously unknown, and some scholars argue that the administrative needs of irrigation management directly produced the social hierarchies and bureaucratic structures that we recognize as hallmarks of civilization. The temples played a central role in this organization, serving not merely as religious centers but as economic hubs that collected agricultural surplus, redistributed resources during times of scarcity, and maintained the records that kept the whole complex system functioning. The quirky fringe interpretation that attaches itself to irrigation agriculture involves the claim that the technology was too sophisticated for early humans to have developed independently, suggesting that the knowledge was gifted by extraterrestrial visitors who needed reliable food production to support their mining operations. This theory, popularized by various alternative historians, notes the apparent suddenness with which sophisticated irrigation systems appear in the archaeological record, interpreting this rapidity as evidence of external intervention rather than incremental indigenous development. The theory further suggests that the Anunnaki, here understood as extraterrestrial beings rather than mythological constructs, selected Mesopotamia specifically because its river systems made irrigation possible, transforming a challenging environment into an agricultural powerhouse that could support the large populations needed for whatever labor-intensive projects the Skylords had in mind. I find this interpretation unnecessarily complicated, solving a problem that does not actually exist since the archaeological record shows plenty of evidence for gradual development when examined closely, but I appreciate its narrative ambition and its faith in the significance of human history on a cosmic scale. The scholarly debate around irrigation and the origins of civilization concerns the relationship between environmental challenge and social complexity. One school of thought, sometimes called hydraulic civilization theory, argues that the need to manage water resources directly produced the centralized states and authoritarian political structures characteristic of early Mesopotamian society. Another school counters that this causal relationship is too simplistic, that complex irrigation systems can be managed by decentralized communities without strong central authority, and that the rise of the state had more to do with warfare, ideology, and elite manipulation than with technical necessity. A third perspective suggests that neither extreme tells the whole story, that irrigation contributed to state formation but did not determine it, that the relationship between environment and society is dialectical rather than deterministic, each shaping and being shaped by the other in feedback loops too complex for simple causal models. The debate continues, as academic debates tend to do, generating papers and dissertations and conference panels and the occasional actual insight into how ancient societies actually functioned. The sleeping dragon of chaos lurks beneath the waters, patient and terrible, waiting for the moment when order will falter and the flood will return. This is Tiamat in her mythological form, the primordial sea that gave birth to all the gods and will eventually be slain by her great-great-grandson Marduk in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that provides our fullest account of Mesopotamian cosmology. But the Enuma Elish dates from the 2nd millennium BCE, far later than our current position in time, and we must be careful not to retroject its elaborate theology onto earlier periods that may have understood these powers quite differently. The proto-Tiamat of the Ubaid period was probably less personified, more a force than a figure, the dangerous salt water that killed crops when it infiltrated irrigation channels, the flood tide that destroyed villages built too close to the shore, the unmappable deep that swallowed fishermen who ventured too far from the marshes. Fear of this power must have been profound, shaping the psychological landscape as thoroughly as the physical landscape shaped daily life, and the rituals performed at the temple platforms almost certainly included appeasement offerings designed to keep the salt at bay, to maintain the boundary between fresh and salt water that made agriculture possible. I like to imagine the prayers, which we can never recover, that the proto-priests offered to the proto-Tiamat, pleading with her to remain in her proper place, to accept the offerings and spare the crops, to remember her children even as she dreamed of swallowing them whole. The other primordial power, Abzu, presented a friendlier face, the sweet water that rose through springs and provided drinking water and irrigation flow. But even Abzu could be dangerous, the underground rivers sometimes surging unexpectedly, flooding fields and undermining foundations, demonstrating that even benevolent powers operated beyond human control or full understanding. In later mythology, Abzu will be killed by Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who will establish his temple above the defeated body of the primordial father, using Abzu's substance to create the watery shrine that will remain his special domain. But this too is a later development, requiring concepts of divine conflict and succession that may not have existed in our current period. The Abzu of the 5th millennium was probably an undifferentiated power, not yet an individual who could be killed, but a cosmic principle as fundamental as gravity or electromagnetism, simply part of how the universe worked rather than a being with intentions and vulnerabilities. The archaeological record shows temples dedicated to water deities from very early periods, their offerings shafts filled with fish bones and shell ornaments and the skulls of water birds, all the creatures associated with the aquatic realm, returned to the divine source from which they came. The marsh communities would have understood their world as alive in ways that we, with our mechanistic physics and our disenchanted cosmos, can barely imagine. Every reed harbored spirit, every fish carried something of the divine, the boundary between natural and supernatural being porous to the point of meaninglessness. This animistic worldview, common to many pre-literate societies, provides the substrate from which more elaborate theologies eventually emerged, the named gods differentiating from the nameless numinousness that pervaded all things. When the Anunnaki finally appear in the textual record, they emerge from this animistic background, carrying traces of their origin even as they take on the anthropomorphic forms that later mythology will develop. The mainstream scholarly position emphasizes this developmental continuity, seeing the great gods of Sumerian civilization as evolutions from earlier, less differentiated spiritual powers rather than sudden arrivals from outside the cultural system. The fringe position, of course, sees genuine arrivals, actual beings who descended from the sky and imposed themselves upon the indigenous religious landscape, incorporating some local elements while introducing new theological concepts that reflected their own extraterrestrial reality. Both interpretations must ultimately grapple with the textual evidence, which is silent for the period we are now discussing and can only be pressed into service through various forms of extrapolation and inference. The evening falls again over the marshes, as it has fallen every day since the earth first acquired an atmosphere, and we watch another community settling in for the night, larger now than the village we visited in the previous section, perhaps 500 people clustered around a temple platform that has grown considerably more impressive. The platform now rises perhaps 15 feet above the surrounding terrain. Built up over generations through the accumulated labor of countless workers, its sides stepped to allow processions to ascend to the summit where the reed shrine houses symbols of divine presence that we can no longer identify with certainty. Attached to the temple complex are storage magazines, rows of pottery jars containing grain and oil and other surplus products, the collected wealth of the community held in trust by the priests who manage distribution according to principles we can only guess at. The administrative functions of the temple are beginning to generate the need for record-keeping that will eventually produce writing, though we are still centuries away from that breakthrough. For now, the priests rely on memory and oral tradition, systems that work adequately for communities of this size, but will prove insufficient as urban complexity increases. The stars emerge overhead as the light fades. The same stars that will later be charted by Babylonian astronomers and incorporated into the astrological systems that will influence human thought for millennia to come. Venus shines brightest, already associated with the goddess who will eventually be called Inanna, though her name and attributes are still taking shape. The constellation that we call Orion traces its familiar pattern across the southern sky, and the marsh dwellers almost certainly have their own name for it, their own story explaining its origin and significance, though these are lost to us, surviving only in the later mythological texts if they survive at all. The relationship between the stars and the gods is already being established, the celestial bodies becoming identified with divine powers in ways that will eventually produce the elaborate astral theology of later Mesopotamian religion. When the fringe theorists speak of the Anunnaki arriving from the stars, they tap into this ancient association, this intuition that the gods dwell above and sometimes descend to interact with the human world below. The intuition predates any specific mythology, rooted perhaps in the simple human experience of looking up at the night sky and feeling small, feeling watched, feeling that something intelligent must inhabit that vast expanse of glittering lights. The scholarly debate about astral religion concerns the direction of influence. Did the gods become associated with stars, or did the stars become personified as gods? Both processes probably occurred in different contexts and different historical moments, the relationship between heaven and earth developing through reciprocal feedback rather than simple one-way causation. Some stars may have been divine from the very beginning, their distinctive brightness or color marking them as special, while other divine powers may have acquired celestial associations only later, as the elaboration of theological systems required cosmic addresses for the various members of the growing pantheon. The important point is that the sky was never simply the sky, not for these ancient watchers, not for us really. Despite our scientific pretensions, we still speak of reaching for the stars, still project our hopes and fears onto the cosmic canvas, still imagine the universe as meaningful rather than merely mechanical. In this sense, we remain the children of Sumer, inheriting not just their mathematical and literary innovations, but their fundamental orientation toward the heavens. The temple priest of this larger settlement performs his evening duties with practiced efficiency, no longer the lonely proto-priest of our earlier visit, but a member of an organized priesthood with defined roles and responsibilities. His superior, the high priest, handles the most sacred rituals and maintains direct communication with the divine powers, while subordinate priests manage the practical affairs of the temple economy, overseeing the collection and distribution of resources, maintaining the physical structures, training the next generation of religious specialists. This division of labor reflects the increasing complexity of the society as a whole, the simple, undifferentiated community giving way to stratified hierarchies with distinct classes and functions. Archaeological evidence confirms this stratification, showing significant differences in burial goods and residential architecture that indicate unequal distribution of wealth and status. Some families are clearly doing better than others, accumulating surplus and passing it on to their descendants, creating the hereditary inequalities that will become even more pronounced as civilization develops. The Anunnaki, when they appear in later texts, will embody and legitimize these inequalities, their divine hierarchy mirroring the human hierarchy below, the order of heaven justifying the order of earth. But for now, the social stratification is developing without divine sanction, emerging from the practical dynamics of food storage and redistribution, from the differential skills and luck that produce winners and losers in any competitive environment. The losers still eat, still find shelter in the temple's protection, but they eat less well and shelter less comfortably than the emerging elite. This is the beginning of something that we still grapple with today. The translation of natural variation into institutionalized inequality, the creation of permanent classes that perpetuate themselves across generations regardless of individual merit. The fringe interpretation sees in this inequality evidence of extraterrestrial design, arguing that the Anunnaki needed a compliant labor force and therefore engineered human society to produce rulers and workers, elite collaborators and mass subjects. The mainstream interpretation sees nothing unusual, merely the normal human tendencies towards status competition and resource accumulation playing out in conditions of agricultural surplus, producing outcomes that, however regrettable, require no extraordinary explanation. I find myself sympathetic to both perspectives in different ways, understanding the appeal of cosmic explanation for social evils, while also recognizing that human beings need no external encouragement to exploit one another. We seem to have invented inequality all by ourselves, which is perhaps our greatest achievement as a species, if achievement is the right word, which it probably is not. The marshes breathe around us, the water level rising and falling with the rhythm of distant tides, and somewhere in the darkness, a night bird calls, its voice echoing across the water like a prayer to gods not yet named. Sleep comes easily in this environment, the soft sounds of water lapping and wind rustling providing the natural white noise that our bodies still crave, that many of you have artificially recreated with fans and sound machines in your modern bedrooms. We are not so far removed from these marsh dwellers, not really. Our nervous systems still calibrated to the acoustic environment of the wetlands where human consciousness first achieved its full flowering. When you lie in bed and find the silence oppressive, when you need some background noise to quiet the anxious chatter of your overstimulated mind, you are responding to programming that evolved in environments very like this one, where silence meant danger, where the absence of natural sounds indicated predators lurking, where the constant subtle music of the living marsh provided both aesthetic pleasure and survival information. The mainstream position on such evolutionary psychology is cautious, warning against just-so stories that explain current behaviors in terms of ancestral adaptations without adequate evidence. The fringe position is less cautious, more willing to draw connections between modern experience and ancient environment, more confident that the deep past continues to shape us in ways we barely understand. Both positions capture something true, I think. The caution serving as necessary corrective to narrative excess, while the speculation opens possibilities that excessive caution would foreclose. We are creatures of deep time, shaped by forces that operated long before history began, and our attempts to understand ourselves must somehow reckon with this inheritance, even as we acknowledge the limits of our knowledge about what exactly we inherited and how. The community sleeps now, all 500 of them wrapped in their reed mats and wool blankets, dreaming dreams that are lost to us but perhaps not so different from our own. Children dream of play and parent attention, adults dream of success and fear failure, elders dream of death and hope for continuation. The specifics differ, the cultural content of the dreams reflecting a world we can barely imagine. But the structures persist, the archetypal patterns that Jung believed connected all human minds in a collective unconscious that transcends individual experience. Whether you believe in Jung's interpretation or not, the fact remains that we share fundamental psychological structures with these ancient dreamers, that their hopes and fears and desires are recognizable to us, even across the vast gulf of time that separates us. We are them, in some meaningful sense, their lives continuous with ours through unbroken chains of influence and inheritance that connect every human generation to every other. When we study them, we study ourselves. When we imagine their inner lives, we plumb our own depths. When we wonder about the gods they worshipped, we explore questions that our own civilization has not entirely answered. The night passes slowly, as nights do when consciousness is suspended, and we drift forward in time once more, skipping across the centuries like a stone across water, moving ever closer to the moment when history will begin and the Anunnaki will emerge from the mists of prehistory into the clearer light of textual evidence. But we are not there yet, and the world we currently inhabit is still ancient beyond reckoning, still wild and dangerous and filled with powers that the later civilizations will tame and name and organize into manageable categories. In this pre-Anunnaki world, the gods remain largely unnamed, their characteristics unstable, their relationships undefined, and humans approach them with the kind of primal awe that organized religion later domesticates but never quite eliminates. This is the religious substrate upon which all subsequent theological elaboration will build, the foundation of fearful wonder that supports the great temple towers and elaborate ritual cycles and complex mythological narratives that will emerge in the coming millennia. And it is beautiful, in its way, this raw religious experience unmediated by institution and interpretation, this direct encounter with the numinous that the marsh dwellers must have felt when they looked out at their world and sensed something looking back. Let this section close with that sense of watchfulness, that intuition of invisible eyes observing from the reeds and the water and the sky, and let us carry it forward into the next stage of our journey, when the eyes will begin to acquire names and faces, and the story of the Anunnaki will properly begin. We descend now into the oldest city on Earth, though calling it a city at this point might be stretching the definition rather charitably, since what we find is less urban metropolis and more permanently occupied ceremonial center with associated residential sprawl. Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves believed to be the first place where the gods established human kingship, sits at the edge of the ancient marshes, positioned at the meeting point of fresh and salt water, where the rivers empty into what was then a more extensive Persian Gulf. The year is approximately 3800 BCE. Still several centuries before writing will allow history proper to begin, but we are closing in on that threshold, approaching the moment when the scattered traces of material evidence will be supplemented by the incomparably richer record of human intention and thought that writing provides. The temple at Eridu has grown impressive, rising through multiple rebuilding phases, each new structure built directly atop its predecessor in the Mesopotamian fashion, creating a stratified layer cake of architectural history that archaeologists will one day excavate with painstaking care, reading the construction sequence like pages in a book written in mud brick. At the current moment, the temple stands perhaps 30 feet above the surrounding plain, approached by a grand staircase that pilgrims climb with offerings in hand, their sandals slapping against baked brick in a sound that carries across the open landscape and announces their arrival to the priests waiting at the summit. This is a sophisticated operation now. The simple proto-priesthood of earlier periods evolved into an organized hierarchy with specialized functions and established protocols, the random scatter of offerings replaced by systematic collection and record-keeping, the spontaneous prayers formalized into liturgies that must be performed correctly or risk divine displeasure. The mainstream Sumerian historical fact for this section concerns the so-called Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary text dating from the early 2nd millennium BCE but describing events believed to have occurred in the distant past. This text, recovered from the Sumerian city of Nippur, describes the creation of humanity, the founding of the first cities, and the great flood that nearly destroyed human civilization. Unlike the later Babylonian flood story preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Eridu Genesis focuses on the Sumerian deity Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, who takes a particular interest in human survival and provides the flood hero Ziusudra with instructions for building an ark. The text is fragmentary, with significant portions missing, but what survives gives us our earliest glimpse of Mesopotamian flood mythology and suggests that the basic outlines of the story were already established by the early 2nd millennium, implying oral traditions that extended much further back into the pre-literate past. Scholars debate how far back we can push these traditions, with some arguing for genuine historical memory of catastrophic flooding in the ancient Near East and others suggesting that the flood narrative is a universal mythological archetype that emerges independently in many cultures regardless of actual flood experience. The quirky fringe interpretation of the Eridu Genesis focuses on the role of Enki, reading his intervention in human affairs as evidence of extraterrestrial benevolence in contrast to the hostility or indifference of other Anunnaki. According to this reading, Enki was the one member of the alien council who genuinely cared about the human beings that the Anunnaki had created as a labor force, repeatedly intervening to protect humanity from destruction or enslavement by his fellow gods. The flood story becomes, in this interpretation, an account of how the Anunnaki majority decided to eliminate their troublesome creations, only for Enki to subvert the plan by warning the righteous Ziusudra and preserving the seed of humanity for future regeneration. This interpretation has the advantage of explaining why the Sumerian pantheon seems so divided on human matters, with some gods supportive and others hostile, as the natural result of political disagreement among extraterrestrial colonizers rather than as a theological abstraction about divine ambivalence. I find the interpretation creative, if lacking in evidential support, and I appreciate how it transforms the flood narrative from a story about divine punishment into a story about interplanetary politics, which is certainly more exciting if nothing else. The scholarly debate surrounding the flood traditions concerns their historical basis, if any. Geological evidence confirms that the region experienced significant flooding events throughout its history, including a particularly severe episode around 2900 BCE that may have inspired or reinforced the mythological narrative. However, flooding was a regular occurrence in southern Mesopotamia, not exceptional enough to generate persistent cross-generational memory without additional cultural factors amplifying the significance of particular events. Some scholars argue that the flood story encodes real catastrophic experience, preserved through oral tradition and eventually committed to writing when that technology became available. Others suggest that the flood narrative is better understood as a mythological trope, a symbolic destruction that provides the occasion for cosmic renewal and the establishment of post-diluvian order, rather than as a record of actual historical events. A third position proposes that the truth lies somewhere between, with real flood experiences providing the experiential basis for narratives that took on symbolic and theological significance, far exceeding their original factual content. The fishermen of Eridu, who provide much of the protein that sustains the growing population, would have known flooding intimately, their lives bound to the rhythm of rising and falling waters, their boats the difference between survival and drowning when the spring melt sent walls of water down from the mountains far to the north. These were practical people, not given to abstract theological speculation, their religious life expressed through offerings and observances rather than systematic doctrine, but their experiences informed the mythology that the priests elaborated, their fear of the flood finding expression in cosmic narratives about divine wrath and miraculous survival. The god who protected them from the waters, whom we now know as Enki, would have been central to their devotions, his shrine at Eridu, the most sacred place in their world, the spot where fresh water bubbled up from the underground abyss and made civilization possible. The transition from fishing village to temple city is not well documented, the pre-literate centuries that witnessed this transformation, leaving behind only material remains that tell us what people built but not why they built it or what they believed about it. Archaeologists have reconstructed the building sequence at Eridu, identifying some 18 distinct temple phases stretching back to the Ubaid period, each representing a rebuilding that preserved the sacred location while updating the physical structure to reflect changing architectural conventions and increasing resources. The earliest temples were simple reed structures, not fundamentally different from the humble platforms we visited in Section 1, but by the late Ubaid period the temples had grown to impressive dimensions featuring elaborate decoration and substantial economic infrastructure. This growth happened without any apparent external stimulus, without conquest or colonization or the kind of disruptive intervention that the fringe theorists propose, simply the natural development of a successful religious center attracting wealth and population over many generations. But the fringe theorists counter that this is precisely what we would expect if extraterrestrial intervention occurred in the form of cultural transmission rather than military conquest, the advanced beings teaching rather than forcing, elevating rather than enslaving, their influence visible only indirectly in the rapid acceleration of cultural development that the archaeological record documents. The argument cannot be definitively settled, as arguments about unobservable causes generally cannot be, and we are left with competing interpretive frameworks that explain the same evidence in mutually exclusive ways. The night falls over Eridu, as it has fallen every evening since time began, the sun sinking into the western marshes and painting the temple's mud-brick facade in shades of gold and crimson that the priests interpret as divine approval, signs that the gods are pleased with the day's offerings and will continue to protect the community from the many dangers that surround it. The dangers are real enough. This is not paranoid fantasy, but accurate assessment of a genuinely hostile environment, where disease and violence and natural disaster constantly threaten the fragile human foothold in the marshes. Child mortality is staggering by modern standards, perhaps half of all children dying before age 5, and the survivors can expect lives that are brief by our measure, most people dead before 40, the priests who reach old age regarded as blessed by the gods they serve. These statistics should not make us feel superior, should not prompt the kind of chronological snobbery that dismisses ancient peoples as primitive or unfortunate, because these were fully human beings, as intelligent and creative and emotionally complex as anyone alive today, doing their absolute best with the resources available to them in conditions that we cannot truly imagine. They loved and feared and hoped and dreamed, and when they stood before the temple at Eridu and offered their fish and their grain and their precious oils, they did so with as much sincerity and devotion as any modern believer approaching any modern altar. The ziggurats are coming, though they have not yet arrived, the modest temple platforms of the current era still centuries away from the towering mountain temples that will dominate later Mesopotamian skylines. But the impulse behind the ziggurat is already present, the desire to build high, to approach the heavens, to create an artificial mountain in a landscape devoid of natural elevation, to bridge the gap between earth and sky through human effort and divine favor. This impulse will eventually produce structures that reach 200 feet into the air, vast artificial mountains visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, announcing the presence of powerful gods and the wealthy cities that serve them. The mainstream interpretation sees in these structures an expression of Mesopotamian cosmology, the ziggurat representing the cosmic mountain at the center of the world, the meeting point of heaven and earth where divine and human realms intersect. The fringe interpretation, predictably, sees landing platforms for spacecraft, the stepped structures providing convenient approach and departure facilities for the vehicles that brought the Anunnaki to Earth and that they used to travel between their various installations around the planet. I have to admit that the image is compelling, these massive structures silhouetted against the ancient sky, their summits lit by fires that guide incoming craft through the darkness. But compelling images are not evidence, and the archaeological record provides no support for the extraterrestrial landing pad hypothesis, showing instead the gradual evolution of temple architecture from simple platforms to complex towers through entirely indigenous processes of development. The scholarly debate about ziggurats concerns their specific religious function, which the surviving texts describe only vaguely. Some scholars argue that the ziggurat was primarily a dwelling place for the city's patron deity, the temple at the summit providing a suitably elevated residence for a god whose proper home was in the heavens. Others suggest that the ziggurat served mainly as a venue for specific rituals, including the sacred marriage ceremony in which the king and a priestess reenacted the union of divine couples, ensuring fertility and prosperity for the coming year. Still others emphasize the political function of the ziggurat, seeing it as a symbol of royal power and civic pride, a monument that advertised the wealth and organizational capacity of the city that built it. All of these interpretations probably capture some truth, the ziggurat being a multivalent symbol that meant different things to different people at different times, its significance evolving over the millennia of its use. We climb the steps of the Eridu temple in our imaginations, feeling the rough brick beneath our feet, smelling the smoke of burnt offerings and the faint fishy odor that pervades this marsh community, hearing the chants of priests and the murmur of pilgrims and the distant splash of boats in the channels below. At the summit we enter the shrine, a dark interior space lit only by oil lamps, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on walls decorated with cone mosaics and painted plaster, the accumulated artistic achievement of generations expressed in geometric patterns and stylized natural forms. At the far end of the shrine stands the cult statue, the physical embodiment of divine presence, though at this early period the statue may be quite simple, not yet the elaborate gold and precious stone figures that will represent the gods in later periods. The priests attend the statue as they would attend a living monarch, feeding it, clothing it, bathing it, performing the elaborate service rituals that maintain the god's willingness to dwell among his people and protect them from harm. This is sympathetic magic raised to a high art, the careful tending of the statue believed to affect the deity it represents, the divine being somehow present in the physical object without being reducible to it. The theology is sophisticated, more sophisticated than we sometimes give ancient peoples credit for, recognizing the distinction between symbol and reality, while also affirming their mysterious connection. When the priests feed the statue, they do not believe they are literally feeding the god, as if the deity required physical nourishment, but they do believe that the ritual act has real effects in the divine realm, that the god appreciates the attention and responds to the devotion. This is not so different from modern religious practice. When you think about it, the candles lit in cathedrals and the flowers placed on altars and the elaborate ceremonies that connect human intention with divine will. We have not changed as much as we sometimes suppose, our religious impulses running along channels carved in the deep past, following paths established by these very marsh dwellers and their descendants. The mainstream position on Mesopotamian religion emphasizes its practical orientation, noting that the gods were approached primarily with requests for concrete benefits rather than abstract spiritual goods. Health, wealth, fertility, military victory, protection from enemies and natural disasters. These were the blessings that worshippers sought, and the elaborate ritual system was designed to secure them through the maintenance of proper relationship with the divine powers. The fringe position reads this practicality as evidence that the gods were real beings, with real power to deliver real benefits, not symbolic representations of abstract forces, but actual extraterrestrial entities with advanced technology that could cure disease, ensure good harvests, defeat enemies, and generally manipulate physical reality in ways that appeared miraculous to their primitive subjects. Again, the interpretations diverge based on underlying assumptions about what the gods actually were, assumptions that cannot be tested directly and must therefore remain matters of belief rather than knowledge. The night deepens over Eridu, and we retreat from the temple summit, descending the steps back to the residential quarter where ordinary people live their ordinary lives in houses of mud brick and reed, their concerns the eternal human concerns of food and family and the future. Children sleep in their mother's arms, old men doze by dying fires, young couples whisper in the darkness, and somewhere a dog barks at shadows, disturbing the quiet with urgent warnings that fade into silence when no threat materializes. This is the world before the Anunnaki, in the sense that the Anunnaki as we know them from later texts have not yet fully crystallized from the diffuse religious substrate that will produce them. The gods exist, certainly, powerful and demanding, and essential to the maintenance of cosmic and social order, but their individual identities remain somewhat fluid, their relationships unsettled, their mythological narratives still developing. Within a few centuries, writing will allow these developing traditions to be fixed and transmitted with greater stability, and the Anunnaki will emerge as a defined collective, the great gods of heaven whose actions shape the world and whose will determines human fate. But for now, we remain in the penumbra of history, close enough to see the outlines of what is coming but not yet able to read the details that only textual evidence can provide. The Eridu Genesis story, when it is eventually composed, will look back on this era as the time of origins, when the gods first established the institutions of civilization and humanity first assumed its proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. Whether the story preserves genuine memory or invents an imaginary past, it will shape how later Mesopotamians understand their own history, providing the mythological framework within which they interpret their experience and justify their practices. And through them, through their texts preserved on clay tablets and their ideas transmitted across cultures and centuries, the Eridu Genesis will influence how we understand ourselves, our concepts of creation and destruction, of flood and survival, of divine intervention and human responsibility, still bearing the marks of their Mesopotamian origin, even when we no longer recognize them as such. Let this section close with Eridu sleeping beneath the stars, the oldest city in the world, dreaming its ancient dreams, and let us move forward once more through time, approaching ever closer to the threshold where history will begin and the story of the Anunnaki will finally enter the light of documentary evidence. We sink now beneath the surface of the world, descending through layers of mud and silt and ancient accumulated debris, passing through the foundations of temples built upon temples, through strata of offerings and refuse and the bones of the countless dead, until we reach the level where fresh water percolates through porous stone, the underground aquifer that the Sumerians called the Abzu, the freshwater abyss that lies beneath all things. This is the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and craft, and the sweet waters that make life possible, and understanding the Abzu is essential to understanding the Sumerian conception of the cosmos and the role of the Anunnaki within it. The year is approximately 3500 BCE, give or take a century or two, the imprecision unavoidable given our continued distance from the beginning of written records, and Mesopotamian civilization is on the verge of the transformation that will produce the world's first cities and the administrative innovations that will change everything. The Abzu is not merely an underground lake, though it is that too, a real hydrogeological feature that the ancient Mesopotamians correctly identified beneath their feet. It is also a cosmic principle, the primordial freshwater that existed before creation and continues to exist beneath the established order, the source of fertility and renewal and the knowledge that allows civilization to function. Enki dwells in the Abzu, not because he is a water spirit, though he is associated with water, but because the Abzu represents the deep foundation of reality, the stable ground upon which everything else rests, the source that keeps giving even as the surface world changes and develops. The temple at Eridu was called the Abzu, the house of the Abzu, and its sacred pool, fed by natural springs, was understood as a gateway to the cosmic deep, a place where humans could approach the waters that sustained them and offer thanks to the god who controlled them. The mainstream Sumerian historical fact for this section concerns the concept of the Me, pronounced May, which Sumerian texts describe as the fundamental principles or divine decrees that make civilization possible. These Me include everything from kingship and priesthood to the arts of writing and building, to the practices of sex and warfare, to the technologies of metallurgy and irrigation. They are not skills or objects, but something more fundamental, the cosmic templates that make specific manifestations possible, existing in the Abzu under Enki's protection until they are distributed to the various cities and peoples who will employ them. The mythology tells how Inanna, the goddess of love and war, traveled to Eridu and persuaded Enki to give her the Me, then fled back to her own city of Uruk before the sobered god could reclaim his treasures. This story probably encodes a real historical rivalry between Eridu and Uruk, with Uruk's eventual political dominance being retroactively explained as the result of divine transfer of civilizational power. But it also reflects genuine theological reflection on the nature and origin of the arts of civilization, asking where these things came from and who has the right to control them. The quirky fringe interpretation of the Me treats them as advanced technologies rather than abstract principles, suggesting that the divine decrees encoded actual technical knowledge that the Anunnaki brought from their home planet and selectively distributed to human populations. The Me of metallurgy, in this reading, was not a cosmic template, but an actual instruction set for smelting and working metals. The Me of writing was not an abstract principle, but a specific technology for recording information. The Me of kingship was not a divine decree but a political protocol for organizing human society according to Anunnaki preferences. This interpretation has a certain internal logic, explaining why the Me were jealously guarded and why their transfer between cities had such significant consequences, but it requires treating mythological language as coded technical discourse, which is a significant interpretive leap that mainstream scholars are unwilling to make. The scholarly debate around the concept of Me concerns its precise nature and how it should be translated. Some scholars prefer divine ordinances, emphasizing the prescriptive character of these entities, their function as rules or laws that govern cosmic and social order. Others prefer arts or offices, emphasizing the practical content of the Me, their association with specific skills and social roles. Still others argue that the concept is untranslatable, representing a uniquely Sumerian way of thinking about the relationship between divine will and human capability that has no exact equivalent in modern thought. The debate matters because how we understand the me shapes how we understand Sumerian civilization as a whole, whether we see it as governed by cosmic law or technological knowledge or something that defies our categories entirely. The Abzu bubbles up through the sacred pool at Eridu, clear water rising from the depths and spreading across the temple courtyard in shallow channels that the priests have constructed to distribute the life-giving liquid throughout the complex. The water is cold, surprisingly cold given the heat of the Mesopotamian climate, and it carries a faint mineral taste that the worshippers interpret as the taste of divinity itself, Enki's essence dissolved in the liquid he controls. Fish swim in the deeper portions of the pool, sacred creatures associated with the god, and the priests sometimes release fish caught in the marshes, returning them to the divine source as offerings of gratitude. The fish motif will recur throughout Mesopotamian religion, Enki often depicted as wearing a garment covered with fish scales or accompanied by fish-bearing attendants, the visual symbolism reinforcing the god's aquatic associations and his role as patron of the fishing communities that still provide much of the regional food supply. The mainstream interpretation sees in this symbolism the natural elevation of local economic activities to cosmic significance, the god of the fisherman becoming the god of the primordial waters, his cult growing as Eridu's importance grows, his mythology elaborating to reflect the increasing sophistication of the society that worships him. The fringe interpretation, naturally, sees something quite different, suggesting that Enki's fish symbolism reflects his origin as an amphibious being, a water-dwelling extraterrestrial whose natural form bore more resemblance to Earth's aquatic life than to its terrestrial mammals. This interpretation connects to the broader theory of amphibious extraterrestrials proposed by various alternative researchers, noting that ancient Mesopotamian art occasionally depicts beings with fish-like characteristics, including the famous images of Apkallu, the fish-cloaked sages who taught humanity the arts of civilization. Whether these images represent actual extraterrestrial visitors, mythological hybrids, priests in ritual costume, or something else entirely, remains a matter of ongoing dispute, with the evidence susceptible to multiple interpretations depending on one's prior commitments and assumptions. We float in the Abzu ourselves now, or imagine that we do, suspended in the primordial waters beneath the temple, the light filtering down through the sacred pool above us as a dim aquamarine glow that illuminates nothing but itself. Down here, in the cosmic deep, time moves differently, or perhaps does not move at all, the Abzu existing outside the ordinary temporal flow that governs the surface world. This is where the me are stored, the divine decrees that make everything possible, catalogued and preserved by Enki and his divine servants, available to be distributed when the appropriate conditions are met. The image is of a cosmic library or archive, a repository of all knowledge and capability, which is not a bad metaphor for the groundwater that sustains agricultural civilization, the hidden resource that makes surface productivity possible. The Sumerians understood, perhaps more clearly than we sometimes credit, the dependency of their way of life on forces they could not directly observe, and the Abzu represents this understanding in mythological form, the invisible foundation without which nothing visible could exist. The scholarly debate about the Abzu's cosmic significance concerns its relationship to other primordial waters, particularly Tiamat, the saltwater sea that we encountered in Section 2. Some scholars see Abzu and Tiamat as complementary opposites, freshwater and saltwater, male and female, creative and destructive, their mythological relationship reflecting the ecological reality of southern Mesopotamia, where fresh and salt water constantly interact. Others emphasize the conflict between these powers, noting that later mythological texts describe Abzu's death at Enki's hands and Tiamat's defeat by Marduk, suggesting that the primordial waters represent chaos that must be overcome for ordered creation to exist. Still others propose developmental readings, arguing that the relationship between these figures changed over time as Mesopotamian theology evolved, early traditions of complementarity giving way to later traditions of conflict as the political and ecological situation of the region changed. The debate illuminates how mythological systems develop, responding to changing circumstances while maintaining apparent continuity with earlier traditions. the same divine names and narrative elements being reinterpreted to fit new theological and political needs. The evening settles over Eridu once again, the light fading from the sky as the priests complete their evening rituals and the community prepares for sleep. We emerge from the Abzu, rising through the water of the sacred pool and up into the temple courtyard, where the last worshippers are making their final offerings before returning to their homes. The air is warm and humid, the ever-present moisture of the marsh environment making the evening feel closer than it otherwise might, the bodies of the people leaving damp impressions on the temple stones as they prostrate themselves before the shrine. Somewhere in the growing darkness, a frog begins to sing, its croaking call immediately answered by others, the marsh filling with the sound of amphibian courtship as the night creatures emerge from their daytime hiding places. The frogs are Enki's creatures too, or so the locals believe, their association with water marking them as belonging to the god of the Abzu, their seasonal appearance and disappearance mirroring the rising and falling of the groundwater level. This is sympathetic thinking, the tendency to associate things by similarity that characterizes much early human cognition, and it produces a worldview in which everything is connected to everything else through networks of relationship that are as real to the people who perceive them as the physical connections we describe in scientific terms. The mainstream position on Sumerian cosmology emphasizes these connections, seeing the divine world as a projection or elaboration of the natural world, the gods personifying forces and features that the Sumerians encountered in their daily lives. The fringe position reverses this relationship, suggesting that the divine world was the primary reality and the natural world a construction or shadow of it, the gods not representing natural forces, but actually controlling them through advanced technology that appeared magical to their primitive worshippers. Both positions must grapple with the textual evidence, which speaks of gods acting in and through nature without clearly distinguishing between divine will and natural process, the boundaries that seem obvious to us apparently not obvious to the ancient writers. The high priest of Eridu retires to his private quarters, a room in the temple complex reserved for his use, more comfortable than the common residences, but still modest by later standards. He is tired from the day's rituals, the constant attention to divine needs being exhausting work, and he looks forward to the few hours of rest before the pre-dawn rituals will require him to rise again. His sleep, when it comes, will be filled with the images and sounds of his waking life, the gods he serves appearing in his dreams as they appear in his conscious devotions, their forms familiar but somehow more intense, more present, more real. The Sumerians took dreams seriously, regarding them as potential channels of divine communication, and priests were particularly attentive to their nocturnal visions, interpreting them for guidance about the future and the divine will. Dream interpretation would eventually become a specialized profession, with extensive textual traditions explaining the significance of various dream symbols and scenarios, but at this early period the practice is probably more intuitive, the priests relying on personal inspiration and traditional wisdom, rather than standardized interpretation manuals. The mainstream scholarly position on Mesopotamian dream practices emphasizes their continuity with cross-cultural patterns of dream interpretation, noting that many cultures worldwide have attributed special significance to dreams and developed methods for decoding their meanings. The fringe position suggests that Sumerian dream practices may have involved more than ordinary dreaming, proposing that the priests used techniques of altered consciousness to achieve communication with extraterrestrial beings who could interface with human neurology through dreams and visions. This interpretation connects to broader alternative theories about consciousness and its relationship to non-human intelligence. Theories that I find speculative but not entirely dismissible given how little we actually understand about the nature of consciousness and its potential connections to realities beyond ordinary experience. The Abzu sleeps beneath us, the cosmic deep undisturbed by the activities on the surface, its waters flowing slowly through underground channels toward their eventual emergence in springs and wells scattered across the region. The water has been on a long journey, falling as rain in the mountains far to the north, percolating through layers of rock and sediment for years or decades or centuries, finally rising to meet the grateful hands of the Sumerians who drink it and bathe in it and offer it to their gods. This water has no consciousness, no will, no purpose, just hydrogen and oxygen atoms bound together by quantum forces, moving according to physical laws that the Sumerians could not have stated, but that they respected nonetheless. And yet they perceived it as divine, or at least as permeated by the divine, Enki's essence flowing through every channel and spring, the gods' wisdom dissolved in the liquid that made their lives possible. This perception was not a mistake exactly, not a confusion between natural and supernatural that we have corrected with our superior science, but a different way of seeing, a different framework for making sense of experience that emphasized relationship and meaning over mechanism and cause. Both frameworks capture something true about the water that rises from the Abzu, and perhaps neither captures everything, the mystery of existence exceeding any single interpretive scheme that human minds can devise. Let this section close with the water still flowing, the Abzu still feeding the world above, and let us rise with the underground currents toward the surface, where the next stage of our journey awaits, and the Anunnaki finally begin to take their familiar forms. The centuries have passed as centuries do, indifferent to human accounting, and we find ourselves now on the threshold of history, approximately 3200 BCE, the moment when writing will emerge and the great silence of prehistory will finally break. The landscape has changed around us, the scattered settlements consolidating into true cities, the temple platforms rising ever higher toward the sky, the irrigation networks expanding to support populations that would have been unimaginable to the marsh dwellers we met at the beginning of our journey. This is the Uruk period, named for the city that will soon dominate southern Mesopotamia, and the transformation it represents is so dramatic that some scholars speak of an urban revolution, a fundamental reorganization of human society comparable in significance to the agricultural revolution that preceded it or the industrial revolution that will follow millennia hence. The cities that emerge in this period are not merely large settlements, but new kinds of social organization, requiring new forms of administration, new technologies of record-keeping, new hierarchies of power and responsibility, new ways of thinking about human relationships and divine expectations. And at the heart of all this transformation sits the figure of Anu, the sky god who will eventually assume his position as head of the Anunnaki pantheon, the father of gods whose celestial throne symbolizes the cosmic order that the new urban civilization embodies and serves. The mainstream Sumerian historical fact for this section concerns the emergence of writing, which archaeological evidence places in the late Uruk period, around 3200–3100 BCE. The earliest writing is purely administrative, consisting of accounting marks on clay tablets that record economic transactions, quantities of goods, names of officials, the mundane data that complex institutions require to function. These proto-cuneiform texts give no direct access to religious or mythological thought, recording only the practical information that the temple bureaucracies needed to manage their growing economic empires. But within a few centuries, writing will expand to include literary content, and the myths and hymns that had circulated orally for millennia will finally be fixed in permanent form, allowing us to read, however imperfectly, what the ancient Mesopotamians actually believed about their gods and their world. The quirky fringe interpretation of writing's emergence suggests that the technology was not independently developed by Sumerians, but transmitted by the Anunnaki as part of their ongoing project of civilizing their human subjects. This interpretation notes the apparent suddenness with which sophisticated writing systems appear in the archaeological record, suggesting that the rapid development from accounting marks to complex literature reflects teaching rather than invention, the Anunnaki providing the cognitive tools that their human servants needed to manage the increasingly complex society that the gods had created. The interpretation further suggests that the timing of writing's emergence corresponds to a specific phase in the Anunnaki's plans for Earth, the need for human record-keeping arising from the expansion of mining and agricultural operations that required more sophisticated organizational infrastructure. I find this interpretation intriguing as a story, though unconvincing as history, since the archaeological record actually shows a perfectly comprehensible developmental sequence from pictographic tokens to abstract signs to phonetic representation, requiring no external intervention to explain. The scholarly debate around writing's emergence concerns its specific social context and motivations, with some scholars emphasizing its administrative origins in temple economies and others pointing to evidence of early writing in non-administrative contexts, including what may be labels on vessels or even early literary compositions. The debate matters because it shapes our understanding of why humans invented writing and what purposes it initially served, which in turn affects how we interpret the relationship between literacy and social complexity, between record-keeping and power, between the technology of writing and the societies that employed it. The sky above the city of Uruk stretches vast and empty, the dome of heaven that the Sumerians called An, a word that means both sky and God. The conflation suggesting how thoroughly the celestial realm was identified with divine presence. Anu, whose name derives from this same root, is the sky personified, or perhaps the sky is Anu depersonified, the relationship between God and natural phenomenon being more intimate than modern distinctions between religion and nature would suggest. In the fully developed Sumerian pantheon, Anu will sit at the apex of the divine hierarchy, the ultimate source of authority from whom all power flows, though he will remain distant from human affairs, delegating the actual work of governing cosmos and humanity to his subordinates Enlil and Enki. This arrangement reflects actual Mesopotamian political structures, where kings ruled through delegation, maintaining symbolic supremacy while allowing lesser officials to handle administration, and it suggests that the divine world was imagined in terms borrowed from human experience, the gods organized along lines that made sense to the people who worshipped them. But the fringe interpretation reverses this analysis, suggesting that human political structures were modeled on divine originals, the earthly kings imitating their celestial masters, the hierarchy of human society reflecting the hierarchy of the Anunnaki that the gods themselves had established. The Anunnaki are beginning to crystallize now, the diffuse divine powers of earlier periods consolidating into distinct individuals with specific names and functions and mythological narratives. Anu sits at the top, the Sky Father, source of authority. Enlil governs the earth and atmosphere, executing the decisions that Anu makes, the active administrator to Anu's passive sovereign. Enki controls the waters and wisdom, the clever god we have already met, dwelling in the Abzu with his treasured me. And beneath these great three spread a whole population of lesser gods, the divine assembly that will eventually number in the dozens or hundreds, each with specific responsibilities and cult centers and mythological traditions. The Sumerian term Anunnaki, which we have been using somewhat anachronistically throughout this narrative, properly refers to this divine collective, the gods of heaven and earth who together manage the cosmos according to principles established at creation. The etymology of the term is debated, with most scholars deriving it from words meaning seed of Anu or princely seed, suggesting that the Anunnaki are understood as Anu's offspring or at least as beings authorized to exercise the sky god's delegated power. The fringe interpretation, following certain alternative researchers, proposes a different etymology, connecting the term to words meaning those who from heaven to earth came, reading into the name itself the extraterrestrial origin that the alternative theory proposes. This etymological argument is linguistically dubious, requiring readings that trained Sumerologists reject, but it demonstrates how the fringe position operates, finding evidence for its conclusions in every available textual feature, whether or not that evidence would satisfy conventional scholarly standards. The concept of the me, which we discussed in the previous section, enters a new phase as the urban revolution proceeds, the divine decrees now being distributed to the various cities that compete for power and prestige. Each city has its patron deity, its own tradition of the me it possesses, its own claim to cosmic significance in the divine order. Uruk has Inanna, the goddess of love and war, whose story of stealing the me from Enki we mentioned earlier. Eridu has Enki himself, the oldest god of the oldest city. Nippur will have Enlil, whose cult center will eventually become the most sacred spot in Sumer, the place where kingship is legitimized and divine favor confirmed. The distribution of the me among these cities reflects real political competition, each city's claim to divine favor, justifying its aspirations to regional dominance. The theological arguments encoding practical power struggles that shaped Mesopotamian history for millennia. The mainstream scholarly position emphasizes this political dimension of Mesopotamian religion, seeing the divine world as a projection of the human political landscape, the gods' relationships reflecting the relationships among the cities that worshipped them. The fringe position sees genuine extraterrestrial politics, the various Anunnaki competing for control over their respective territories and human populations, their conflicts playing out across both heaven and earth in ways that the human scribes recorded without fully understanding. The scholarly debate around Mesopotamian political religion concerns the direction of influence. Did human political structures shape divine hierarchies? Or did religious ideas shape political arrangements? Or did both develop together in reciprocal interaction that defies simple causal analysis? The question may be unanswerable, at least with the evidence currently available, but wrestling with it illuminates how thoroughly religion and politics were intertwined in ancient Mesopotamia, the sacred and the secular not yet separated into distinct domains but functioning as a single integrated system that made no sharp distinction between divine will and royal decree. The night falls over Uruk, a city now, not a village, perhaps 30,000 people living within and around its walls, the largest concentration of humanity that has ever existed, a new thing under the sun or under Anu's celestial dome. The temple of Inanna rises at the city's heart, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the last light, its sacred prostitutes concluding the day's rituals of divine pleasure, its priests tallying the accounts that will be recorded on clay tablets and stored in the temple archives for future reference. The streets below are busy even as darkness falls, merchants closing their shops, workers returning to their homes, children playing in the narrow alleys between mud brick houses, the whole complex organism of urban life winding down for the night, but never quite stopping, never achieving the total silence of the earlier marsh villages, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were occasions for alarm. This is a different world, a world that would have been unrecognizable to the proto-priest we met at the beginning of our journey, a world transformed by the accumulation of changes that individually seemed minor but collectively constituted a revolution, and yet the basic human concerns remain the same: food, shelter, family, meaning, the gods above and the water below, birth and death, and the brief flicker of consciousness between them. The people of Uruk would have understood the proto-priest if they could have spoken to him, would have recognized his fears and hopes as their own, would have knelt beside him at the same altar and offered the same prayers to powers that both of them felt but neither could fully comprehend. This is the thread that connects all of human history, the shared consciousness that makes these ancient people our kin despite the vastness of the time that separates us, and when we study them, we study ourselves, our own potential and our own limitations reflected in their achievements and failures. The Anunnaki stand waiting in the wings of this world, not yet fully arrived in the sense that the mythological texts have not yet been written, but present nonetheless as the crystallizing divine powers that will soon receive their permanent names and narratives. Anu watches from his celestial height, his throne established among the stars, his children assembling below him in the hierarchies that will govern heaven and earth. Enlil prepares to take his place as chief administrator of the cosmos, the god whose decisions will determine human fate, whose favor kings will seek, whose anger will bring flood and plague and the destruction of cities. Enki tends his Abzu, his me safely stored, his wisdom available to those who know how to ask for it, his special affection for humanity, positioning him as advocate and protector in the divine councils, and Inanna, young and fierce and beautiful, gathers her powers in preparation for the adventures that will make her the most vivid personality in the Sumerian pantheon, the goddess who descends to the underworld and returns, who steals the me and faces no consequences, who loves and destroys with equal passion, who represents everything that is dangerous and desirable about divine power. These are the Anunnaki, Or rather, these are the gods who will be called Anunnaki when the term achieves its full significance, the divine collective whose actions shape the Sumerian understanding of cosmic and human history. Whether they represent psychological archetypes, personified natural forces, socially constructed ideological figures, or actual extraterrestrial beings remains a question that each of us must answer according to our own convictions and interpretive frameworks. The evidence supports multiple readings, as evidence often does, and the choice among them reflects values and assumptions that go beyond what mere evidence can establish. The mainstream scholarly position treats the Anunnaki as products of human religious imagination, sophisticated constructions that reveal how ancient Mesopotamians thought about divine power and human dependency. The fringe position treats them as real beings whose activities were recorded, however imperfectly, by the scribes who came after them. I find myself moved by both positions, appreciating the scholarly caution that resists extraordinary claims while also feeling the pull of the extraordinary, the intuition that there might be more to these ancient stories than mere mythology, more to the cosmos than our confident sciences currently acknowledge. Let this section close with the Anunnaki waiting, poised at the threshold between prehistory and history, ready to assume their full identities when writing makes their stories permanent, and let us prepare for the final section of our journey, where we will gather together the threads of everything we have explored and drift towards sleep with the ancient gods watching over us. We have traveled far tonight, you and I, drifting back through the millennia to worlds that existed before written memory, guided by the oldest words ever pressed into clay and by the older intuitions that precede all words. We have stood in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia when they were wild and unsettled, watching the first reed huts cluster around the first temple platforms, feeling the breath of gods who had not yet acquired their permanent names. We have followed the slow accumulation of changes that transformed scattered villages into consolidated cities, simple offerings into elaborate rituals, diffuse spiritual powers into the structured pantheon of the Anunnaki. And now we gather together the threads of our exploration, weaving them into a pattern that might, if we are fortunate, illuminate something true about the human condition and our endless fascination with the divine. The question that has haunted our journey from the beginning concerns what existed before the Anunnaki arrived, and the answer we have discovered is both simple and complex. Human beings existed, fully human, as intelligent and creative and spiritually hungry as anyone alive today, doing their best to make sense of a world that did not readily yield to understanding. They built temples because they sensed something sacred in the world around them, something that demanded acknowledgement and response. They developed rituals because regular practice helped them feel connected to powers greater than themselves, helped them navigate the uncertainties of existence, helped them create community with others who shared their devotions. They told stories because stories make meaning, transforming raw experience into comprehensible narrative, connecting individual lives to larger patterns that give those lives significance. The Anunnaki, when they finally emerged, represented the culmination of these impulses, the full flowering of Mesopotamian religious imagination in forms sophisticated enough to be recorded and transmitted across generations. Whether the Anunnaki also represented something more, something that transcends human imagination and points to realities beyond our current understanding, is a question that each listener must answer for themselves. The mainstream scholarly position says no, the gods are projections, products of human consciousness that reveal how we think, rather than what exists independent of our thinking. The fringe position says yes, there were real beings, extraterrestrial visitors whose actions inspired the mythological traditions and whose legacy we can still detect in texts and artifacts and perhaps in our own genetic heritage. Both positions are held by sincere and intelligent people. Both attempt to make sense of evidence that genuinely puzzles, and neither can claim definitive victory in a debate that may never be conclusively resolved. What we can say with confidence is that the pre-Anunnaki world was not empty, not waiting for external salvation, not incapable of progress until advanced beings arrived to set things in motion. The Ubaid farmers who drained marshes and planted crops, the Eridu priests who built the first temples, the Uruk administrators who invented writing to track their increasingly complex affairs, These were all human achievements, accomplished through human effort and intelligence, requiring no extraterrestrial assistance, however appealing such assistance might be as narrative device. The mainstream position celebrates this human achievement, finding in it evidence of our species' remarkable capacity for innovation and adaptation. The fringe position, paradoxically, sometimes diminishes this achievement, suggesting that we needed help, that we could not have done it alone, that our accomplishments are not really our own, but borrowed from superior beings whose technology we mistook for magic. I find myself resistant to this diminishment, wanting to honor the genuine creativity of our ancestors, even as I remain open to possibilities that exceed our current scientific consensus. The truth, if there is a single truth about such matters, probably lies somewhere in the complicated space between confident affirmation and confident denial, in the territory of mystery that neither science nor alternative theory has fully mapped. The night has grown deep around us now, the hours passing as we journeyed through ancient time, and the moment approaches when sleep will claim us as it claimed the marsh dwellers and the city builders and all the countless generations who have stared up at the stars and wondered what might live among them. The stars themselves have not changed, not perceptibly, their light traveling across the vast distances of space to reach our eyes as it reached the eyes of Sumerian astronomers who first charted their positions and gave them the names we still use. Orion still strides across the winter sky, the Pleiades still cluster in their familiar pattern, Venus still shines brighter than any other point of light in the heavens, and if there are beings out there watching us, they have been watching for a very long time, their patience measured in millennia rather than moments. The pre-Anunnaki world was a world of water and reeds, of mud brick and reed bundle, of fish and grain and the endless cycle of seasons that governed agricultural life. It was a world without writing, which means a world whose inner life is largely lost to us, recoverable only through archaeological inference and comparative analysis and the later texts that may or may not preserve genuine memories of earlier times. It was a world of community and competition, of cooperation and conflict, of birth and death and the struggle for survival that has characterized all life since life first emerged from the primordial waters. And it was a world of gods, or at least of something that the people who lived in it experienced as divine, presences felt, but not fully comprehended, powers invoked but not controlled, mysteries that deepened rather than dissolved the more closely they were examined. These mysteries remain with us, however much our explanations have changed, however confident we have become in our scientific descriptions of natural phenomena. We have not explained away the mystery of existence, only renamed it, translated it into terminology that satisfies our contemporary sensibilities without actually answering the questions that drove our ancestors to build temples and compose hymns and speculate about the nature of divine power. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is consciousness and how does it relate to the physical processes that appear to produce it? Is the universe ultimately meaningful or merely mechanical? Are we alone in the cosmos or surrounded by intelligences we cannot yet perceive? These questions haunted the pre-Anunnaki world as they haunt us, and no amount of technological progress or scientific advancement has brought us significantly closer to definitive answers. The Sumerians would understand our uncertainty, I think, would recognize in our puzzlement the same bewilderment that drove them to kneel before the temple platforms and offer their fish and grain and oil. We are not so different from them, not really. Our superficial sophistication masking the same fundamental limitations that they faced, our explanations as provisional as theirs, our confidence as likely to be overturned by future generations as theirs was overturned by us. This recognition of continuity, of shared human condition across the vast gulf of time, is perhaps the most valuable thing our journey has offered, a reminder that we are part of something larger than ourselves, connected to all who came before and all who will come after, participants in an ongoing story whose ending we cannot know. The Anunnaki, whether real or imagined, represent an attempt to make sense of this story, to give it shape and meaning and direction, to answer the questions that consciousness inevitably asks when it awakens to its own existence. They are our ancestors' answers, not our own, and we are free to reject them or reinterpret them or simply hold them with the appreciation we extend to all creative human achievements. But we should not dismiss them too quickly. should not assume that our own answers are obviously superior, should not mistake our different vocabulary for deeper understanding. The mystery persists beneath our explanations, as the Abzu persists beneath the temples, and we approach it best with the humility that acknowledges how little we actually know, despite how much we have learned. As you lie there, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, let the images of our journey float through your mind like reeds floating on marsh water. See the proto-priest scattering barley flour on his modest platform, his prayers rising with the smoke into the morning sky. See the fishermen of Eridu casting their nets into sacred waters, their catches offered to the god who dwells beneath. See the scribes of Uruk pressing their styluses into wet clay, recording the transactions that keep the great machine of civilization running. See Anu on his celestial throne, watching with ancient eyes the human world that his children govern, patient and remote, and perhaps not quite as imaginary as our scientific age assumes. These images belong to you now, woven into your memory by the words we have shared, available to return in dreams or quiet moments of reflection, connecting you to the deep past that is never entirely past, but always present in the structures of our thought and the architecture of our institutions. The pre-Anunnaki world gave us many things: the foundations of agriculture, the first experiments in urban living, the administrative technologies that make complex society possible, the religious impulses that still shape how we think about meaning and purpose, and the sacred dimensions of existence. It gave us, most fundamentally, ourselves, our ancestors, surviving and reproducing and passing along the genetic and cultural inheritance that makes us who we are. And it gave us questions, wonderful, unanswerable questions that drive us still, that keep us searching for explanations, even when we know that final explanations may be impossible, that make us stare up at the stars and wonder if anything is staring back. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the ancient dark. Thank you for your attention, your imagination, your willingness to drift with me through times and places that no longer exist, except in the traces they left behind. If you have enjoyed this exploration, if it has helped you relax into sleep, or given you something interesting to think about, I hope you will subscribe to this channel and share it with others who might enjoy these nocturnal excursions through history. And if you have questions or observations or alternative interpretations of the material we have covered, I welcome your comments, your engagement, your participation in the ongoing conversation that makes this project meaningful. But for now, the time has come to release these ancient concerns and let sleep claim what remains of the night. Let your breathing slow, your muscles relax, your mind empty of the day's anxieties, and fill instead with the soft images of water and reeds, of starlight on temple walls, of prayers rising into the endless sky. The Anunnaki watch over you, or perhaps they do not, but something watches, something that knows you better than you know yourself, something that has accompanied human consciousness since consciousness first flickered into existence on this small planet, orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable corner of a vast and mostly empty universe. Rest now, safe in the knowledge that you are part of something ancient and ongoing, connected to all who came before and all who will follow, your brief flame of awareness adding its light to the great fire of human experience that has burned since the beginning and will burn until the end. Sweet dreams, friends, and good night.